we just walk down the street, like in the middle of the street if we want to? I mean, in a traffic, busy street, I mean, no, right? So there's certain movements and certain things that we can't do that are prescribed because of automobiles, correct? Anything else? What about the way we think about how far away things are? You know, is that influenced by automobiles at all? You know, when we tell somebody, how far away is Provo from Salt Lake, what do we usually say? About an hour, 40 minutes. So we're already thinking in terms of automobiles, right? And this is how automobiles are so integral to our culture. Well, I'm going to be talking about automobiles in Korea. And when I think about automobiles in Korea today, you might think about big auto brands like Kia and Hyundai, which are like really big in the United States as well. We might think about, in Seoul, if you go to Seoul today, how it's just crowded with automobiles, buses, and taxis and things. But I'm kind of a history nerd, and so we are going to be looking at an earlier period in Korea's history, the early 20th century, when automobiles were first introduced, and there was quite a bit less automobiles then than there was now. In fact, about 1922, 1923, this is about 90 years ago now, in Korean history, at that point, there was about 900 automobiles in the whole country. Was it like millions now? But even though there wasn't nearly as many as there were now, they were still making a big impact in the way, in Korean culture, influenced the way people thought about themselves and their place in society. And I think that looking at a time in history, in Korea's history, at a time when automobiles were less present and less ubiquitous, less common they are now, we can actually learn a lot about the ways automobiles influence ourselves and our society. So when automobiles first show up in Korea, it's debatable like when the first one actually came, but a lot of people argue that it was the last emperor, King Kojong, we talked about him a little bit in class, that in 1903, commemoration of like the 40th anniversary of his reign, he actually imported an automobile that probably looked something like this. And so automobiles first show up. Well, how do you describe an automobile to someone who's never seen an automobile? So for people who are seeing automobiles for the very first time, I mean, how do you think of an automobile? How do you describe it? I mean, it's something we so commonplace to us now, right? Well, luckily, when I was doing some research for this project, I found a newspaper article published in 1917 in Korea, which talked about some rural villagers in North Korea, actually, what's now North Korea, and they were seeing an automobile for the first time, and it kind of recorded some of their reactions. And so the description was that it was a big wagon with 4 wheels about the size of a house that drives along very quickly, can go over a hill like this, at the speed a bullet does, and pum pum korida, like it makes a pum pum sound. And so, interesting, huh? I mean, we were kind of used to the automobile, so the concept of trying to describe it to someone who's never seen it before is a little bit foreign to us. But those were some kind of initial reactions to the automobile that were recorded with them. Now, here is an advertisement, an early advertisement for automobiles in Korea that I was able to pull up from the newspaper. And you notice it's a Ford. I mean, for those of us who've been to Korea, how many Fords did you see in Korea, or American automobiles in general? Like 1, 2? Yeah. Well, the Korean automakers in the last half of the 20th century made a lot of progress. And so Korean streets today are filled with Kias and Hyundais and Daewoo's and different things like that. But during this period, actually, the majority of cars were Fords, Chevrolets, American auto makes that were imported into Korea. But anyway, the automobile, when it was first introduced, was seen by many as sort of an instrument of civilization, as a symbol of modernity, something that was very modern and new. And so, understanding the automobile as an instrument of civilization, we can learn a bit about what civilization meant for Koreans during this time. And so this is the early 20th century. This is, we went over it briefly during our sort of history lectures, the period of Japanese colonial rule. So civilization during this time was really stratified. There was a large distinction between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and those who are poor. And the automobile served to sort of strengthen that distinction. 자동차, as it's called, or the automatic cart in Korean, you had the wealthy who got to enjoy the pleasures of this new implement, driving around town, forcing everyone else off the road, Whereas the poor, as depicted in this photograph, could only sort of admire it from afar. And so civilization really, in many ways, existed only for the wealthy who got to enjoy the benefits of new technology like the automobile. Unless, of course, they happen to go riding out in the countryside, as in this picture, you get mired down in a bunch of mud, and then that poor peasant's ox is actually going to come in handy. And this was a frequent occurrence during the early days of motoring in Korea when roads weren't all that great. Now, to tell the truth, so in preparation for this project, I did quite a bit of looking through different old newspaper articles about automobiles in Korea. What I found most frequently reported were accidents. Traffic accidents, you have cars, they're going to crash. What's interesting is that when cars first came into Korea, many of the accidents weren't car-to-car, but cars with pedestrians. So you can imagine the society where no one really was used to having automobiles around. There was a lot of traffic laws, especially at first, and so a lot of the tangles happened with people and cars rather than cars and cars. And so we talked about earlier how there's this divide between the poor and the rich, how the rich could afford to ride in cars or to own them, but the poor couldn't. And so I think it's accurate to say that if you're a poor Korean at this point, it's more likely that you're going to end up under a wheel rather than behind one. There was one of the very first automobile accidents in Korea involved this wealthy individual who was driving and actually ran over a 7-year-old child. And sort of interesting illustration of sort of the period and culture at the time, because later, when this man tried to sort of reimburse the hospital fee for this child, probably the poor dad, probably didn't have much in the way of wealth, had to say no, he had to refuse it because of sort of the divide and these Confucian customs and stuff that existed, and he just felt like it was rude to accept the money, so he didn't. But accidents, of course, occurred on a frequent basis, but like I said, at an early basis, many of them involving pedestrians in automobiles rather than automobiles. But later you have tangles like this one between a streetcar and an automobile. Now, so we use the automobile to try to understand the civilization of the time. We can use it to say that, it sort of emphasized how there was this divide between the rich and the poor. We can also use it to understand sort of politics of the time, right? This was the period of Japanese colonial rule. So the Japanese were in charge of the colonies. So how did the automobile, this new invention, kind of figure into all this? Well, there's a quote, actually, I'm going to share with you, by a book. This is a history book about colonial modernity in Korea, where it says, modern technologies created multiple possibilities for increased political and cultural oppression, or governmentability by the colonial state, while concretely creating new spaces for political resistance and cultural expression. So what that means in a nutshell is basically the fact that you had automobiles meant that they could be regulated. And that's what the Japanese colonial regime did. Like this, for example, here's a newspaper article describing the implementation of driving on the left side of the road. Where do Koreans drive now? Right side, right? American style. Well, Japanese to the day drive on the left side of the road, and during the colonial period, actually traffic was conducted much in the same way. So it wasn't actually until after the end of colonial rule, when the Americans came in and occupied South Korea, that it was switched to the right. But this sort of symbol to show that traffic and all these things dealing with automobiles, licenses and those things were all under the control of the colonial regime, so they could do what they liked. But at the same time, it's interesting, you have, looking through these stories and these articles about cars in early colonial Korea, I encountered interesting stories about Korean resistance, about ways to kind of silently, sort of wordlessly kind of fight back somewhat against the colonial regime using automobiles. For example, in a place called Sariwon in what's now modern-day North Korea, there's a story, this is in in the 1920s occurred about there were some taxi drivers that were at a train station. And some of you have been like a busy area, especially in South Korea, where there's a lot of taxis, you notice they kind of line up. So you kind of ride in one at a time. And you're kind of expected to go to the first one, which was okay. Go to the first one, and then the next one comes up, and kind of go like that way. There's an order. Apparently this has been around a while, because this article talked about this. It talked about how there was 2 Japanese taxi owners and a Korean one. But how anytime a Korean came out of the train station, they would just go like the Korean taxi. They didn't even bother with the Japanese one, even though it was the first line. It's kind of a way of saying, I have to put up with like colonial rule, any little chance I can get to kind of like emphasize my Koreanness and identity, like I'm going to, even if it's just riding in a Korean-owned taxi. And so it actually caused a little bit of a struggle, and the Japanese taxi owners, what they ended up doing is they talked to the train station owner, who I'm imagining was probably Japanese, and they said, okay, this guy, we got to kick him out. So they ended up kicking him out. But other stories exist about the creation of automobile cooperation societies by Koreans, sort of things that could be used to sort of not only like give budding like taxi drivers and different things like some help, but also to kind of fight back against maybe these times of sort of government suppression and stuff. So interesting. Now, interestingly too, kind of reading about automobiles placed near the Korea, I found lots of references to Kiseng, which we're going to probably talk a lot more about, and automobiles. And apparently, the colonial government was worried that these newfangled cars were kind of these vehicles of sin, where people would just use them to pick up Kiseng and they just ride around all, rebelliously, kind of into the wee hours, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, causing all sorts of hazard and being a general public nuisance. And so there's even an effort, as this article says, it says that, with the Kiseng right here, all they have to do, if they just get into a car, if they're even seen getting into a car, they're going to be punished, like they're going to be arrested. And so there's different stories about people riding around with Kiseng and running people over and different things, but I think the general idea is that, there's these cars and these Kiseng were almost kind of scandalous, and so no one liked the idea of them kind of being able to ride around at will and doing what they want, including the colonial regime. So shut it down. And I found this quote from, this is from an early literary work called Peace Under Heaven by author Chae Man-sik. It was published in 1938. And there's an interesting piece of dialogue I thought kind of spoke to sort of automobiles' place in colonial society. And what this is there's this, basically a Kiseng, she's basically a mistress of this wealthy master yun. And she's talking, and they're out on the town, and they're about to go home, and she says, let's get a taxi. And he says, a taxi? He's like, yeah. And he agrees, and she's kind of puzzled, because this guy in the story is known for being quite the miser. And so she's like, yes, a taxi. And so you can already see that back then, like, taxis, now we kind of think a taxi, like, it's kind of low class almost, like anyone rides a taxi. But back then, like, it was actually kind of for the wealthy, But of course, he's a miser, and he tricks her and he says, yeah, we're riding in a car, a huge silvery car, brightly shining. And she's like, you mean a bus, don't you? And then she was sad for being silly. And here is an example of an early bus. And so you can already see sort of the automobiles weren't too common, and what they were used for, not only for transporting kind of people you're engaged in illicit affairs with,